Okay, so we're going to talk about Passover, and like I said, this is going to be basically, whenever it comes to keeping a commandment, I always think of, first off, can we keep the commandment? And then the second question is, should we keep the commandment? So if we can keep the commandment, then in my opinion, we should. If we can't, then we start looking at why. Is it our circumstances? Can we change our circumstances? That kind of thing. When we get to things like Passover, a lot of times people will answer the question in the affirmative and they'll say, yes, we can keep Passover, but we shouldn't for X, Y, Z reasons. Or maybe we shouldn't do it this way, maybe we should do it this other way. And so I just kind of want to just kind of strip it down to like as basic as we can make it. What does the scripture say, we're supposed to do, those positive commands? Can we do those? And then once we establish that, we'll take a look at, does that apply to us today to actually do those physical commandments? So the obvious place to start with Passover is Exodus 12. And this is where we get the month of Abib is introduced, first month of the year. And we get the Passover instructions. This is for the very first Passover. So Exodus 12, we're going to read the whole chapter. There's going to be a lot of reading today. Now Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month they are each one to take a lamb for themselves, according to their father's households, a lamb for each household. Now, if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor nearest to his house are to take one according to the number of persons in them. According to what each man should eat, you are to divide the lamb. Your lamb shall be an unblemished male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats." A lot of people don't realize you can also have goat for Passover. A lot of people may not want to have goat for Passover because goat seems to be, I see some hands up, yeah, but it is possible. So this is going to be one of those things that's relevant when we talk about can we keep this commandment. So you can take it from the sheep or from the goats. So we'll just pause right there. And first off, the command is to all the congregation of Israel. So the first thing we need to look at, and this is kind of more like should we keep the commandment, but either way, what is Israel? So like if we understand that Israel is people who are voluntarily covenanted with the God of Israel, Yahweh, then that can be flesh and blood Israelites, that can be flesh and blood Jews, it can be non-flesh and blood Gentiles. Anybody that has voluntarily submitted to his authority is an Israelite. So when we understand that and we go back and we read these commandments that are positive commands or even the negative commands that deal with Israel, I think we need to say, this could apply to us, and then we need to, go from there. So this is, in my opinion, this is talking to us today. Obviously, we weren't there for the first Passover, but the principle is there. So you get together, and on the 10th day of the month, you take your lamb or your goat. It has to be a male, it has to be a year old. And if, let's say that there's a newlywed couple that lives in a house, okay? Like a year-old lamb is not some little small cuddly thing. It's basically an adult lamb. It's a sheep. Like they've got horns. They're chunky. And so imagining a couple eating a whole lamb in one night, it's pretty much impossible. So he makes the provision for, if that's your situation, find a neighbor near you, and then you guys all get together. That way everyone can eat the lamb and there's no waste and everybody gets what they need. So there's a degree of preparation here, okay? So for us today, if we're going to keep Passover, we need to identify who our neighbors are that we're going to keep Passover with, right? Because if we're going to get into this whole idea of like actually doing a lamb, if you're going to do a whole lamb, it takes planning. It takes organization. You've got to figure out where are you going to do the Passover? Where is the lamb going to be? All that kind of stuff. Which families are going to get together to eat it so that it doesn't get wasted. So these are things to consider when we're looking at can we do this commandment. With the goat, if for whatever reason you're in a place where you don't have access to sheep because not everybody has shepherds around them, A lot of people have goats. If you've got a goat that's suitable, you could do that goat. So there are ways that we can keep Passover that the Father has provided that kind of make it easier than it might seem. So verse 6, you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation is to kill it at twilight. Moreover, you shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roast it with fire, both its head and its legs, along with its entrails. You shall not leave any of it over until the morning, but whatever is left of it until morning you shall burn with fire. So we're just going to pause right there because, again, we're looking at can we do this. Now, we could do the blood on the doorpost, but in the should we, there's no indication in all the Passovers that came after this that anybody put blood on their doorposts. And with the second Passover, they were in the wilderness. They were still at Sinai. They weren't in houses anymore. They were in tents. So just from a practical perspective, putting animal blood on a canvas or leather type tent seems like a bad idea. Like it just seems like it's going to be messy. It's going to be just not great. If it's on like stone or something around your door, or maybe like finished wood, maybe you can clean it off later or whatever, but on fabric or skin, it just doesn't seem like a good idea. So, but anyway, for the first Passover, they definitely did that. Subsequent Passovers, there's no indication that they did or that we would need to, because the destroyer is not coming every single Passover. He only came for the first one. But when we look at how they're doing it, you're roasting it whole, and you're not allowed to boil it or anything. You're supposed to do it with its entrails, it says. And when you look at that word for entrails, this is not talking about like all of the guts. Because sometimes people will do, I've known people who have done a whole lamb, and they just put the whole lamb on, like wool and everything, guts and everything, and it's kind of gross, hope nobody's eating, but it exploded from all of the pressure inside the abdominal cavity. So when you look at this word for entrails, he's not talking about the intestines, he's not talking about the stomach, he's not talking about those organs. Like in that Hebrew word, all of that stuff can be taken out. You're not expected to cook that. So that makes it a lot nicer. And then, of course, you eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And you're not supposed to leave any of it until the morning. So you're supposed to, whenever you do the lamb, and we're not going to focus on the timing so much because there's a lot of debate on the timing. Like, is Passover on the night of the 13th going into the 14th, or is it on the night of the 14th going into the 15th? There's been debate on that forever. And my family, like every year we read it, and it's like, it's the 13th going to the 14th. And next year it'll be, it's the 14th going to the 15th, because different texts lead you different directions. And so I don't really want to address that here. But it's if you're going to keep Passover, what are we going to do? And so you eat it, and it's got to be all, whatever you don't eat has to be burned with fire, has to be all gone in the morning. So far this is pretty basic. You get together with your neighbors, and you kill the lamb, you roast it, you eat it, and it has to be all done by the morning. So verse 11, you shall eat it in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is Yahweh's Passover. So this is a commandment that we've tried to keep literally pretty much every time we've kept Passover. We have staffs made up, Ezra and I do, and we will actually have the staff in hand. We'll all have shoes on. Obviously, we're dressed. And, this whole idea of Passover being a memorial, we're looking back to what Passover was. And we're kind of tapping into that ancient memory of Yahweh's deliverance. And these people had to be ready to go. Like, it wasn't like, well, get your stuff packed and come on. Like, this morning, we're trying to get around for Sabbath. It took forever, for everybody to get their water bottles filled, and they did a good job, but it's a chore just getting a family ready to go someplace. You're trying to get a whole nation of people. It's estimated that we're talking about 2 million people here by the time you factor in all the children. So to get all those people mobilized to just go out on a moment's notice, there's no time for dilly-dallying or dawdling. They've got to be ready to go. So verse 12, for I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods or the Elohim of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Yahweh. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live, and when I see the blood I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So he's making clear what's going to happen here, and he makes it clear in verse 11 that it's Yahweh's Passover. And this kind of parallels in Leviticus 23, where he says these are the holy days, or these are the feasts of Yahweh. He doesn't say these are the feasts of the Jews. These are his. And so logically, if you're his people, you do his things. So continuing in verse 14, now this day will be a memorial to you, and you shall celebrate it as a feast to Yahweh. Throughout your generations, you are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance. So that information feeds into the question of should we? So if we've answered can we in the affirmative, now it's should we. Well, does this statement apply to us? Are we in that period where he says throughout your generations, and are we in that period that he calls permanent? So permanent means permanent usually, but we've been taught that permanent ended at Calvary. So I don't think it did. I think when he said permanent, and when he said forever, and when he said everlasting, I think that goes beyond Calvary into wherever it leads into the eternity. So we're going to read some unleavened bread stuff here, but it's relevant here. And like I said, we'll get into that next month more specifically. Verse 15, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, but on the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats anything leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation, and another holy assembly on the seventh day. No work at all shall be done on them, except what must be eaten by every person, that alone may be prepared by you. You shall also observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a permanent ordinance. So he's going to say this a lot. Every time we look at Passover, every time we look at unleavened bread, and weekly Sabbath and a whole bunch of stuff, he says it over and over and over again. This is because I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Like, he really wants us to remember what he did there. Verse 18, in the first month, on the 14th of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. 7 days there shall be no leaven found in your houses. For whoever eats what is leavened, that person will be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a stranger or a native of the land. You shall not eat anything leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel, and he said to them, go, take for yourselves lambs according to your families, and slay the Passover. You shall take a bunch of hyssop, and dip it in the blood which is in the basin, and apply some of the blood that is in the basin to the lintel and the two doorposts, and none of you shall go outside of the door of his house until morning. So this gives another clue. It's subtle, but when we look at how we're going to do this, can we do it? How are we going to do it? It's the idea that when you slay the Passover lamb, you're draining its blood into a bowl, and that blood is going to be used to go along the doorposts. Now, for us today, not doing the blood around the doorposts, I don't see a need to catch the blood for that purpose, but we would still want to do it just kind of for obvious cleanliness reasons. You don't want a big mess. Okay, so verse 23. For Yahweh will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, Yahweh will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to smite you. You shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children forever. When you enter the land which Yahweh will give you, as he has promised, you shall observe this rite. And when we get into the should we questions, what we're going to find is he'll use these statements where he says, when you enter into the land, do this. There aren't any statements that say when you leave the land, stop doing it. Because that's one of the arguments that people throw out. Well, we're not living in the land, so therefore we don't have to do these things. We don't have to keep Passover. We don't have to keep Sukkot. We don't have to keep any of the holy days because we're not in the land of Israel. But what we'll find is, like I said, there's no commandment that says when you leave the land, you stop doing these things. Okay, and by the way, if anybody has questions, we're going to take those at the end. So hopefully everybody's taking notes. We have pens up here if anyone needs pens. Oh, sons versus children. Yeah, that's the Hebrew word. I think there it's going to say ben or maybe benign. And so like Hebrew has masculine and feminine nouns, but it doesn't have neutral. So like every noun is either male or female. So that word for children, if it's plural, can be children, but it can also be sons. So it just depends on the context. So the women, the ladies don't have a way out. Sorry. Okay, so we were in verse 25. When you enter the land which Yahweh will give you, as he has promised, you shall observe this rite. When your children say to you, what does this rite mean to you? You shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to Yahweh, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes. And the people bowed low and worshipped. And the sons of Israel went and did so, just as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. Now it came about at midnight that Yahweh struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. So even the firstborn of cattle were wiped out over this. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron, Pharaoh, at night, and he said, rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, and go worship Yahweh as you have said. Take both your flocks and your herds as you have said, and go and bless me also. So a few weeks ago, we talked about this idea of holiness. Like you start your journey with holiness, and you end it with holiness. The whole idea is you come out of where you were. You come out of the people. You come out of this worldly kingdom, and you come into Yahweh's kingdom. Pharaoh is basically talking about that. He says, go out from among my people and worship your God. So he is pushing, you guys go be holy. It's gotten to the point to where the powers that be, the main primary power in the world, is wanting these people to be holy. And we look around the world today and we're nowhere near the point to where Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates and whoever are like, you guys just go be holy and do your thing. We're not there. So it makes me wonder how things are going to go forward, prophetically, but that's a whole other thing. So we'll keep reading. And so the Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we will all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, and we'll talk about this next month in detail, with their kneading bowls bound up in the clothes on their shoulders. Now the sons, or the children of Israel, had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of gold and silver and clothing. And Yahweh had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Now the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot, which I think is interesting, about same word for the Feast of Tabernacles, about 600,000 men on foot aside from children. So when you factor in 600,000 men plus their wives plus children, we're looking at potentially around 2 million people. So this is a big, big number here. A mixed multitude, dare we say Gentiles, also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. They baked the dough which they had brought out of Egypt into cakes of unleavened bread, for it had not become leavened, since they were driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years, and at the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of Yahweh went out from the land of Egypt. So now we're going to bring it back to Passover specifically. It is a night to be observed for Yahweh, having brought them out from the land of Egypt. This night is for Yahweh, to be observed by all the sons of Israel throughout their generations. Now that word for night to be observed, when you look at it in the Hebrew, it literally means night watch or night vigil. So it has the implication that you're staying up all night and you're on the alert and there's a sense of urgency. And so this is something that I'm in the process of studying, but there's an idea that I had never even processed this before, But the idea that you slay the lamb like in the afternoon or maybe up towards sunset and then you stay up all night eating it. Most people will eat the lamb in the evening or maybe early afternoon, late afternoon, and then go to bed at night. But from a practical perspective, it makes sense to me if you're going to be up all night doing this night watch, this night vigil thing, maybe that's when you're eating the lamb. Because if you slay it at sunset or twilight, then you're obviously not going to be eating it before you kill it. So late afternoon, whatever. But that's something I'm studying and I haven't come to a conclusion yet. So, okay, so verse 43, Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of Passover. Now this is really important. No stranger, this says foreigner, no stranger is to eat of it. This is somebody who, this is, in the Hebrew, this is, I think, the word goy or goyim. This is somebody who is a non-Israelite, and they have no intention of doing anything the Israelites do. Okay, so they're not even remotely interested, even though they might be in the land, they just don't care. They're not supposed to be eating it. We're going to get to the idea here in a minute of a ger. Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of Passover, no foreigner is to eat of it, but every man's servant purchased with money, after you have circumcised him, then he may eat of it. A sojourner or a hired hand shall not eat of it. It is to be eaten in a single house. You are not to bring forth any of the flesh outside of the house, nor are you to break any bone of it. We'll talk about that here in a minute. All the congregation of Israel are to celebrate this. Again, if you're part of Israel, there's a positive command here to celebrate this. If a stranger sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover to Yahweh, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near to celebrate it, and he shall be like a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person may eat of it. So this is talking about what's called a ger. This is somebody who is not an Israelite by flesh. They're a Gentile. They're from the nations. They live in the land among the Israelites, and they want to be a part of it. These are like your Ruths. Ruth would be considered a ger. This is talking about her. So she wants to assimilate into Israel. She wants Yahweh to be her Elohim. And so these people are allowed to eat the Passover provided that everyone's circumcised. All the males are circumcised. And then they're allowed to eat the Passover. So there is a requirement that if a male is going to eat the Passover, and when it says the Passover, that's always talking about the lamb, then they have to be circumcised. Now, my position is that it doesn't say that you can't be in the room at all. If you're a circumcised male, an uncircumcised male, you can be in the room. You're just not going to actually eat the lamb itself. Okay, so this is not excluding people who haven't been circumcised from the whole thing. It's just saying they can't eat the lamb. And then also, whoever is considered a stranger or a foreigner who has no intention of being part of Israel, they're excluded across the board, circumcised or not, because why would you do this thing that honors Yahweh's sovereignty unless you want to yield to that sovereignty? Okay, so verse 49, I think I just read that, yeah. This same law shall apply to the native as to the stranger who sojourns among you. Then all the sons of Israel did so. They did just as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that same day, Yahweh brought the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. So that's a lot of reading there, but it gives the nuts and bolts of what a Passover is. So you have a whole lamb. You've got multiple families getting together to make it work just logistically. And you can remove its actual guts. You're leaving things in it like it's hard to describe unless you see it, but like when you open up a lamb, there's this pocket kind of in the back that's surrounded by fat, and that's where the kidneys and things are. That's not considered entrails. You leave that in the lamb. But like the stomach, the intestines, the colon, all that stuff can go. Okay, so you don't obviously want to have that stuff while you're cooking your meat. You'll sour your meat. And then, you eat it with bitter herbs. You eat it with unleavened bread. Now, the bitter herbs, there's debate on what that means. When I first started doing this, like almost 20 years ago, it was horseradish. That was the default, and I absolutely hated it because I can't stand horseradish. Horseradish just messes me. It's like a nuclear bomb in my head. And I remember that, my first 2 years doing it, I did a traditional Passover Seder in the group there in Texas. And so they had the salt water, the egg, they had the apple and honey thing. I always forget what the Hebrew word is. And the whole thing, the horseradish. And I'll never forget the guy I was sitting with, they just told us that this horseradish, this bitter herb, is supposed to represent the sin in our lives, the bitterness of sin. And he's just piling it on, because he loved it. And it was just this weird thing, like, you're loading up symbolic sin here. It was just weird. Symbolism is like that. But anyway, so that was the only 2 times I ever did like a traditional Jewish Seder. After that, it was always some variation of trying to be more specific to the text here. We were talking with the kids the other day. We were reading about in Jeremiah 35 about the Rechabites, and they had this family tradition where somewhere down the line, one of the patriarchs told them, "I don't want you guys drinking alcohol. I don't want you guys living in cities. I don't want you guys, even having farms. You're basically going to be Bedouins living in tents." And all the subsequent generations honored that, and they lived that lifestyle basically by the decree there. And so, anyway, so there's where was I going with that? I lost my train of thought. Anyway, so you have that, and then if you want to be really literal, you're eating it, obviously dressed. You've got your shoes on, you've got a staff, and we're just kind of reenacting what happened. In my mind, when we look at why we have these rehearsals, I always think he has us do these repetitive things to be prepared for it happening again. And I don't have it in front of me, but when you go into Jeremiah 31, when you look at that version in the Greek Septuagint, you won't see it in our Masoretic Hebrew, but in the Greek Septuagint, it specifically says that Yahweh will bring his people from the land of the north at the Feast of Passover. So there's some, anecdotal evidence that he may start the second Exodus, whenever that is, he may start it on a Passover. So that it makes sense to me, to be prepared for every single Passover as if it was the first Passover, to have that same sense of urgency, to have that same sense of preparation, and be ready to go, because maybe that will be when he does the second Exodus. Just something to kind of think about there. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. We just kind of read through all that, and like I said, if you have any questions, hopefully you're taking notes. We'll take those later, and hopefully have some discussion. We're going to go to Exodus 34 now. I'm just going to grab one verse out of it. That chapter there that we just read is the bulk of the actual instructions on what to do for Passover. Exodus 34:25. He's just kind of gone over the two tablets of stone, the second set of 10 Commandments. And in verse 25, let's just back up. Let's back up in verse 23. 3 times a year all your males are to appear before Yahweh Elohim, the God of Israel. For I will drive out nations before you and enlarge your borders, and no man shall covet your land when you go up 3 times a year to appear before Yahweh your Elohim. So he's talking about the 3 pilgrimage festivals. He's talking about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He's talking about Shavuot or Pentecost, and he's talking about Sukkot. But then he says in verse 25, "You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor is the sacrifice of the Feast of Passover to be left over until morning." And this is just kind of repeating what he said earlier, but this time it's interesting because he actually calls it a sacrifice. And so when we get into the should we question, people will say, well, we can't make sacrifices anymore because Messiah came, but there's different types of sacrifices. When you look at the typology of the Passover lamb, Passover typologically has nothing to do with our sin. That's Day of Atonement. But Passover by itself is about deliverance from the world, deliverance from bondage, that kind of thing, deliverance from Egypt. It's about Yahweh's sovereignty. It's not about our sin. So there are sacrifices for free will offerings, for Thanksgiving offerings, things like this, that are not sin offerings. So if we're looking typologically at, Messiah's sacrifice on Calvary as an atoning sacrifice for our sins, and we're saying, well, we shouldn't do sacrifices in the literal because of that spiritual sacrifice, which actually was a physical sacrifice too, I feel like we're kind of missing the point, because something like Passover I don't think falls under that umbrella. That's my opinion, but I'm pretty convinced that that's true. But it is a sacrifice, so it's just something to be aware of. Leviticus 23 and verse 5. Of course, we got to read this one. This just kind of reiterates a little bit of it. Leviticus 23 in verse 5. And he just says, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, that twilight is Yahweh's Passover. And this is in that whole chapter where he spells out all of his feasts, and he says these are the feasts of Yahweh. Again, not the feasts of the Jews. So it's just more information on when to do it and how to do it, on the 14th day of the first month. Numbers chapter 9. This is going to be the second Passover. And by second Passover, I don't mean Passover in month 2. We'll get to that in a minute. But this will be the second time they kept Passover. This is at Mount Sinai, a year after they got there. And so Numbers 9, we're going to read verses 1 through 14, if I can ever get there. Numbers 9, 1 through 14. Thus Yahweh spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Now let the sons of Israel observe the Passover at its appointed time. On the 14th day of this month, at twilight, you shall observe it at its appointed time. You shall observe it according to all its statutes and according to all its ordinances. So basically what he's saying is here, everything I told you to do earlier for the last Passover, I want you to do again now. And so there is an argument you can make. They put the blood around the doorpost on the first Passover. So if I just break this down grammatically, when he says all, that would include everything they did the first time. So there are people that will take these scriptures and they will use it to say, well, we have to put blood on the door too. And I'm not saying that's wrong, because I do see where they're coming from. I'm just saying practically I don't see a need to do that because the destroyer is not coming every year at Passover. That was the whole point of putting the blood around the door. Verse 4. So Moses told the sons of Israel to observe the Passover. They observed the Passover in the first month on the 14th day of the month at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that Yahweh had commanded Moses, so the sons of Israel did. But there were some men who were unclean because of a dead person, so that they could not observe the Passover on that day. So they came before Moses and Aaron on that day. Those men said to him, Though we are unclean because of the dead person, why are we restrained from presenting the offering of Yahweh at its appointed time among the sons of Israel? So this is important. So when we go back to Exodus 12 and 13, that whole area, there's nothing in there that says a person has to be ritually clean in order to keep the Passover. But these men, for some reason, think because they're ritually unclean, they can't do the Passover. And of course, a lot's happened in that 1 year. And that 1 year, we've gotten pretty much all of the commandments handed down to Moses. We've gotten all those commandments about how to build a tabernacle, about ritual purity, all that stuff has come in now. That stuff wasn't on the table at the first Passover. Okay? And the second thing is, they're calling it an offering. And we just read earlier where it's called a sacrifice. We do know from all the other texts that when a person is going to present an offering to Yahweh, they have to be ritually pure. You can't just come up into the tabernacle or temple in a ritually impure state, which is basically a way of saying an unholy state, and offer an offering. You need to wait until you're actually able to. And this is going to be something relevant later when we read about Hezekiah. So what's the answer here? Verse 8. Moses therefore said to them, Wait, and I will listen to what Yahweh will command concerning you. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, If any one of you or your generations, which would be us, becomes unclean because of a dead person, or is on a distant journey, he may, however, observe the Passover to Yahweh. So they didn't ask about what if you're traveling, but Yahweh is compassionate, and he's kind, and he wants to do things to help his people. So he's looking ahead at situations that will impact our ability to keep this holy day, and he's providing provisions for that. In the second month, verse 11, on the 14th day at twilight, they shall observe it. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall leave none of it until morning, nor break a bone of it. According to all the statute of the Passover, they shall observe it. But the man who is clean and is not on a journey, and yet neglects to observe the Passover, that person shall be cut off from his people, for he did not present the offering of Yahweh at its appointed time. That man will bear his sin. If a stranger sojourns among you and observes the Passover to Yahweh according to the statute of the Passover, and according to its ordinance he shall do so. You shall have one statute, both for the stranger and for the native of the land. So there's nothing saying that Gentiles can't do this. Non-Israelites can't do this. But if you're going to do this, like we read earlier, you need to submit to Yahweh's authority and his sovereignty. You need to come in, your males need to be circumcised, you need to actually be committed to being a part of Israel. You need to be a ger, not a goy. And so it's also interesting here because this is what we're going to look at, like I said earlier, when we read Hezekiah, he's going to tap into this and use it basically as a way to keep the Passover when they really shouldn't technically. But where was that? Yeah, okay, I wanted to bring out this whole breaking the bone thing. We mentioned earlier that you're not supposed to break a bone, right, of the Passover lamb. And we know that when the Messiah was killed, like it specifically says that none of his bones were broken. They were getting ready to smash his legs so that he would just hurry up and die, but he was already dead. So Yahweh orchestrated the whole thing to where, the Son of Yahweh, who is the ultimate culmination of what the Passover lamb represents, no bones would be broken on his body, just like the lambs that represented him all those years. And so this is where, I've had a paradigm shift on this recently. Historically, when we've done Passover, we've just always done, up until recently, but historically, we've done like a leg of lamb from the grocery store, or maybe lamb chops, something like that. Because it's a smaller amount of meat, it's manageable, a family can eat that. But when you really think about it, that's not what the command is. The command is to, if a lamb was going to be too much for your family, get with another family. A command like this is one of those things that if we allow, it fosters community and it fosters tribe. And I mean, if you just think about it, what if you and your neighbor are on bad terms? Like if you live in a neighborhood and all your neighbors hate your guts, or vice versa, or however it is, to keep this commandment, you have to figure that out. You're going to have to get with them. You're going to have to resolve those issues, at least for one night. And so it's one of those ways that Yahweh just kind of pokes and he doesn't force us, but he kind of prods us and pushes us to be together. He wants us to be a united people. But, if we can keep the commandment, if a person is able to do like an actual whole lamb, and it's my opinion that if we coordinate and plan soon enough, we can make that happen regardless of our circumstances. You're going to have people that live in town and live in small apartments. You're going to have people that live in big cities with little tiny yards and all this kind of stuff. We're all spread out geographically. But if you plan far enough ahead of time, I do believe that for the most part, we could all find a way to actually participate in a Passover as prescribed in the text with an actual lamb. Because there are people that live in the country, there are people that have the means, but if we coordinate, we can make it happen. My opinion, but I really don't see why we couldn't do it and if we have enough planning ahead of time. So, the whole broken bone thing, I'm kind of convicted that for me personally going forward, I'm not going to eat a Passover lamb if it's got broken bones. Like if it came from the grocery store, it's got broken bones somewhere down the line. So to me, it just makes more sense to actually kill the lamb yourself. That way you have control over its health. You have control over what it's been eating. You have control over how it's killed. You know its bones aren't broken because you didn't break them. If you're going to eat lamb from the grocery store, it's not that much of a stretch to just go ahead and just do it yourself. Every deer season, people have no problem going out and hunting deer and dressing the deer and eating the deer, but for whatever reason, when we think about Passover, it's like, oh, we can't do that. Anyway, so let's go to Deuteronomy 16. And hopefully we're learning something. I want to keep it just as basic nuts and bolts as we can, and I'm trying to kind of just illustrate what the text says, and then, can we do what the text says and leave the tradition out of it? And I'm trying to leave the calendar debate out of it. Like I said earlier, I'm not really getting into like the timing, 13th, 14th, 15th, all that stuff. What does it mean between the evenings? There's so much debate on that, we'd be here until tomorrow if we were really going to go through all that. But Deuteronomy 16, we'll read verses 1 through 7. Deuteronomy 16, 1 through 7. Observe the month of Abib and celebrate the Passover to Yahweh your Elohim. For in the month of Abib, Yahweh your Elohim brought you out of the land of Egypt by night. You shall sacrifice the Passover to Yahweh your Elohim from the flock and the herd in the place where Yahweh chooses to establish his name. We're going to get to this in a minute because this is relevant to the should we do it question. You shall not eat leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat it with unleavened bread, the bread of affliction. For you came out of the land of Egypt in haste. Now I have a confession to make. When Shauna makes unleavened bread, it is not the bread of affliction. It's not. There's no affliction at all when she makes it. The store-bought stuff, yes. That's the stuff we eat when we want to afflict ourselves. But her stuff, it's incredible. It's incredible. Okay. So, for 7 days no leaven shall be seen with you in all your territory, and none of the flesh which you sacrifice on the evening of the first day shall remain overnight until morning. He called it a sacrifice again. You are not allowed to sacrifice the Passover in any of your towns which Yahweh your Elohim is giving you. That's why you live in the country. Wink, wink, right? But at the place where Yahweh your Elohim chooses to establish his name, you shall sacrifice the Passover in the evening at sunset, at the time that you came out of Egypt. And we're going to read about this in a minute. We know historically that Israel would come to Jerusalem, to the temple, and they would do Passover there. Of course, it makes sense. If you've got to come to Jerusalem for the Feast of Unleavened Bread anyway, you might as well be there for Passover. But this specifically says that we're not just supposed to offer it just any old place. We're supposed to do it in the place where Yahweh chooses to place his name. Now, it's interesting. Now, they hadn't conquered Jerusalem yet, but when this was... depending on how you process the Torah, we know that at least most of it was written by Moses. But scholars believe that at some point somebody took those writings and edited it, compiled it, kind of put it all together. And specifically the Deuteronomy, people think that that happened at the time of Jeremiah, maybe under King Josiah. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but there are things in the language that seem to kind of maybe point that way. There's key phrases and key uses of different words that kind of look like Jeremiah, that kind of look like 1st and 2nd Kings, kind of like maybe they were all written by the same person or group of people around the same time. I don't know. But in any case, it doesn't say that this is Jerusalem. That's my point. And we know that Yahweh's name doesn't always literally mean his literal name, Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh. The more significant meaning of it is his authority, his sovereignty. So this is the place where he's going to choose to place his sovereignty, his authority. And we know that he did that at one point in Jerusalem at the temple. Obviously, that's not the case now. Okay, so verse 7, you shall cook it and eat it in the place which Yahweh your Elohim chooses. In the morning you are to return to your tents. So they're not eating it in their houses. Okay, they're all here. They're in tents, it says. In the morning, they're returning to their tents, which means that they did not eat the Passover in their tents or in their houses. So when we look at doing Passover today, I used to be of the opinion, I can't leave my house all night. I have to eat the Passover in my house, and I can't leave my house. And because of that, you extrapolate that out to corporate Passovers, right? Group Passovers. Well, if I can't leave my house for Passover, how am I supposed to come over to you guys' house for Passover, and vice versa? We can't get together. You know what I mean? So, but these people apparently were eating it like, I envision it like a big campfire, almost like Sukkot. They're just out there hanging out, and eating Passover together, and then they come back home in the morning. That's how it reads to me. So to me, that gives you more leeway to get with other people, and you're not just locked down in your house over Passover night. 6 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a solemn assembly to Yahweh your Elohim. You shall do no work on it. So, and then, of course, that ties into the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Let's see, I was going to read through, I already read that, okay. So that's talking about Passover again. That gives us a little bit more detail. And again, it calls it a sacrifice. And it says that we basically, wherever Yahweh has his name established, that's the only place we can do Passover. Okay, and we're going to unpack that here in a minute. So now let's go to 2 Kings. 2 Kings, and we're going to read chapter 23. Oh, 2 Kings, not 1 Kings. First Kings doesn't have a chapter 23. Okay, this is about King Josiah. So we're going to read verses 21 through 27. So Josiah was one of the good kings. You had like King Asa, you had King Hezekiah, you had Josiah. And when we read about Josiah, like the language implies that not even David or Solomon were at this level. And that's mind-boggling because you think of David and Solomon as like the preeminent kings of Israel. So this is verses 21 and 20 or through 27. Then the king commanded all the people, saying, "Celebrate the Passover to Yahweh your Elohim, as it is written in this book of the covenant." So they had just found the Torah in the temple. The temple had been sitting vacant, cobwebby, whatever, for a long time, and the priest just found it. Like, hey, what's this? So these people had, gone a long time without the word of Yahweh, and all of a sudden, the king has access to it. He's reading it, just as some background, and he's looking at it, and he's like, wait a minute. All this bad stuff that's happened to us over the centuries is because we haven't been obeying this covenant. We haven't been loyal to our God. Well, let's change that. And he just immediately instituted reforms. He was doing everything he could at warp speed to get the people back on track, the same way Hezekiah did. So he's reinstituting Passover. Verse 22, "Surely such a Passover had not been celebrated from the days of the judges who judged Israel, nor in all the days of the king of Israel, the kings of Israel, and the kings of Judah." So that would include David and Solomon. So he's basically saying, like, this has never happened at this level in all of Israel's history, which is very sad when you really think about it. This should have been happening every single year. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was celebrated to Yahweh in Jerusalem. Moreover, Josiah removed the mediums and the spiritists and the teraphim and the idols and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, that he might confirm the words of the Torah which were written in the book of Hilkiah the priest, found in the house of Yahweh. Before him there was no king like him, who turned to Yahweh with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might. Deuteronomy 6, right? The Shema. According to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. Of course, he was one of the last kings of Judah. However, Yahweh did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, with which his anger burned against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. Yahweh said, "I will remove Judah also from my sight, as I have removed Israel, and I will cast off Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen, and the temple of which I said, my name shall dwell there." So right here, he's saying, I appreciate everything you did, Josiah. This is great, but it's too little too late collectively. I'm going to remove my authority from Jerusalem. And he doesn't just say he's going to remove it from the temple, because obviously the temple is going to fall a little bit later to King Nebuchadnezzar. But he's removing his authority from Jerusalem. Okay? So if he's removing his authority from Jerusalem in a physical, temporal way, where is his authority? Because if he doesn't have authority there, does he have authority anywhere on earth? I would say emphatically, yes, he does. So we'll take a look at what that means. Let's go to Malachi. I'm going to try to make a case for where his authority is, and this will tie into where we can keep the Passover. Because remember, we just read, you can only offer the Passover in the place where Yahweh chooses to place his name. So if he removed his name from Jerusalem, where does he have it placed? We need to find that spot, and then we can keep Passover there. So Malachi, chapter 3. Malachi is the last chapter in the Older Testament. He tells us to remember the law of Moses, and then you turn the page, and then we're supposed to forget, right? Chapter 3, we're going to read verses 16 through 18. Now, the whole context of this, he has been really laying into the priesthood. The priesthood has been just a bunch of, it's almost like modern-day politicians, taking advantage of the people, taking advantage of their position, not helping the people who really need it, grifting. It's just terrible. And they've just made a mockery of the priesthood. They've made a mockery of Yahweh's authority, and he is really letting them have it through the prophet Malachi. But in verse 16, we read, then those who feared Yahweh, or revered Yahweh more accurately, spoke to one another, and Yahweh gave attention and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written before him for those who fear Yahweh and who esteem his name or his authority. They will be mine, says Yahweh of hosts, on the day that I prepare my own possession, and I will spare them as a man spares his own son who serves him. So you will again distinguish between the righteous and the wicked, between one who serves Elohim and one who does not serve Elohim. So he's talking about people who actually revere Yahweh and yield to his authority. They're going to be put in this book of remembrance. He doesn't tell us what it is. I think it's probably the Lamb's Book of Life it talks about in Revelation, but it doesn't say for sure. But he's talking about, as a result of this, this is how he's going to distinguish between the righteous and the wicked, and between the ones who serve Elohim and the ones who don't serve Elohim. So, in other words, if you don't serve Elohim, you're not going to revere his name. You're not going to revere his authority. If you do serve Elohim, you're going to do exactly that. Okay? So this is talking about people who are yielding to his authority. And excuse me. And I don't have the scriptures because there's a few in the New Testament, but Paul talks several times. He talks about it like in Ephesians chapter 5 and other places. He talks about this hierarchy. Like the hierarchy goes from like the father to the son to the father, the husband, to the wife, and then to the children, right? It's supposed to be like a bottom-up kind of hierarchy. It's a chain. So like, if the son is obeying the father, and the husband is obeying the son, and the wife is obeying the father, the husband, and the children are obeying the wife, everyone's obeying the father. So in my opinion, if you have a family, if you have a household that is honoring that chain of command, Yahweh's name dwells in that house because his authority is in that house, because you are submitting to his authority. So we have a decentralized structure here at this point. We don't have a local place. Jerusalem right now, it might sound controversial, but Jerusalem is not a holy place right now. If you look at what's going on in the city, it doesn't matter where you go there. It's bad. You've got the Islamic presence there. Just what Israel, just what the Jews are doing there, it's not a holy place anymore. So I think at this point, the holiness dwells with individual families and hopefully on a bigger scale, communities. And so, in my opinion, when we look at should we keep the Passover, if the hang-up is, well, we can't do it because we can't do it at the temple, I would disagree. I would say that there's a way made for a person to do the Passover in their community, in their family, if that community and family is submitted to Yahweh's authority, if they are actually in reverence and covenantally committed to him. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that's not too controversial. So now we're going to go back to Chronicles. We're going to go to 2 Chronicles. We're going to read in more detail about Hezekiah and Josiah. Because Hezekiah specifically had a situation where he wanted to do it, but he couldn't do it the right way. And we're kind of in that same boat now. For those of us that want to keep the commandments, and it doesn't just have to be Passover, it can be any commandment. There are lots of commandments that it's impossible for us to literally keep the way they're written today for whatever reason. So then the question comes, well, because we can't keep it hyper-literally, do we just not bother to keep it at all? Or do we just do the best we can? And I think Hezekiah is going to show us the model for that, doing the best we can. So 2 Chronicles chapter 30. We're going to read the whole chapter. Now this is the same thing as Josiah. Hezekiah had that moment where they found the Torah in the temple and brought it to him, and he had his eyes open. I was like, wait a minute, whoa, let's put the brakes on this. Let's clean up. Let's get all the idols, the shrines out of here. Let's clean up the temple. Let's get everything back on track and start doing what this book says. So now Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah. So this is not just the people in the south around Jerusalem. He's sending it to all the 12 tribes. They haven't been united in centuries at this point. So he sends a letter. He sends to all Israel and Judah letters also to Ephraim and Manasseh that they should come to the house of Yahweh at Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover to Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel. For the king and his princes and all the assembly in Jerusalem had decided to celebrate the Passover in the second month. Okay? Now remember earlier we read, if you're going to do Passover in the second month, it's for two reasons. You were defiled by a dead body, a carcass. Maybe you had to bury a family member, something like that. or you were on a long journey, and so therefore you couldn't be there to do it. So Hezekiah's situation is none of the above, but he decided he's going to do it the second month anyway. And we're going to read why. So, since they could not celebrate it at that time because the priests had not consecrated themselves in sufficient numbers. So the people were going to bring their lambs to the temple here. The priests were going to do the offerings, okay? Now, it's important to know that every priest is a Levite, but not every Levite is a priest, okay? It's kind of like how all Pennsylvanians are Americans, but not all Americans are Pennsylvanians, okay? So that's going to be important to know as we read through this. There weren't enough priests to do the offerings for everybody. So in the first month, okay, so in the second month even. So they've got a quandary. And so the priests had not consecrated themselves in sufficient numbers, nor had the people been gathered to Jerusalem. So Hezekiah just put this on them really fast. They didn't have time to prepare. So in a perfect world, you would think, well, maybe not a perfect world, but you could make the case, well, Hezekiah's looking at a situation. He's saying, we don't have enough priests that are ready. The people aren't here yet. Let's just not do it this year. Let's just wait until next year when we can do it right. But that's not what Hezekiah's heart was. Hezekiah's heart was, I want to get this people under Yahweh's authority now. I don't want to wait another day because it's been too long. The temple was basically in ruins at that point. It was still standing, but it was, who knows what was going on in there. They had all kinds of idols in there, dust, cobwebs. It was a mess, okay? So he wants to rectify that immediately, and that's his heart. And so he says, thus the thing was right in the sight of the king and all the assembly. Okay, so everybody's like, okay, let's do this. This makes sense. Let's do this. So they established a decree to circulate a proclamation throughout all Israel from Beersheba even to Dan, so from the far southern point to the far northern point, that they should come to celebrate the Passover to Yahweh, Elohim of Israel, at Jerusalem, for they had not celebrated it in great numbers as it was prescribed. This is what we'll talk about earlier in Josiah. Nobody had ever really done Passover in big numbers. The couriers went through all Israel and Judah with the letters from the hand of the king and his princes, even according to the command of the king, saying, O sons of Israel, return to Yahweh, Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, that he may return to those of you who escaped and are left from the hand of the kings of Assyria. Do not be like your fathers and your brothers who were unfaithful to Yahweh, Elohim of their fathers, so that he made them a horror as you see. Now do not stiffen your neck like your fathers, but yield to Yahweh and enter his sanctuary, which he has consecrated forever, and serve Yahweh your Elohim, that his burning anger may turn from you. For if you return to Yahweh, your brothers and your sons will find compassion before those who led them captive and will return to this land. For Yahweh your Elohim is gracious and compassionate, and will not turn his face away from you if you return to him. So what he's referring to, he's referring to 1 Chronicles 7. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray. We know the whole thing. A lot of us can quote it in our sleep, right? And the whole idea is that when you find yourself in this situation, because the whole thing started with Solomon's prayer. When we find ourselves in a situation where we've strayed from you, we've been banished to the lands, all these woes have come upon us, and we repent and we come back to you and we pray towards this place, then please hear us and heal us and bring us back. And Hezekiah is appealing to that right here. He's this whole thing. That's what he's counting on here. Okay, so verse 10. So the couriers passed from city to city through the sanctuary, from the country of Ephraim and Manasseh, and as far as Zebulun, but they laughed them to scorn and mocked them. So it's like, well, why would we come down to keep Passover with you guys? Like, it's been centuries. We're doing just fine up here with Baal and whatever. Like, why would we do that? Nevertheless, some men of Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. They humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem, which means they were submitting to Yahweh's authority. The hand of Elohim was also on Judah to give them one heart to do what the king and the princes commanded by the word of Yahweh. Now many people were gathered at Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the second month, a very large assembly. They arose and removed the altars which were in Jerusalem. They also removed all the incense altars and cast them into the brook of Kidron. Then they slaughtered the Passover on the 14th of the second month. And the priests and the Levites were ashamed of themselves and consecrated themselves and brought burnt offerings to the house of Yahweh. They stood at their stations after their custom, according to the law of Moses, the man of Elohim. The priests sprinkled the blood which they received from the hand of the Levites. For there were many in the assembly who had not consecrated themselves. Therefore, the Levites were over the slaughter of the Passover lambs for everyone who was unclean, in order to consecrate them to Yahweh. For a multitude of the people, even many from Ephraim and Manasseh, Issachar and Zebulun, had not purified themselves. Yet they ate the Passover otherwise than prescribed. For Hezekiah prayed for them, saying, May good Yahweh pardon everyone who prepares his heart, and this is key, everyone who prepares his heart to seek Elohim, Yahweh Elohim of his fathers, though not according to the purification rules of the sanctuary. So the issue here is the people's hearts are ready. He's talking about these people's hearts are prepared to do this. They want to do this because they are yielding to Yahweh's authority. There's not an issue of circumcision. That doesn't come up here at all. The issue is ritual purity. Okay? So what's happening is the people are bringing their lambs to the temple. Levites are the ones actually doing the slaughtering. Okay? Normally the priests, the Aaronic priests would do that, but there weren't enough of them consecrated. A lot of them were still unclean. So the Levites who were clean pitched in and took up the slack. Okay? That's what's going on here. Now, next year after this, now that they've had time to prepare, they're going to make sure that all the actual priests are consecrated and ready to go so they won't have to do this again. But Hezekiah is basically counting on Yahweh's mercy and grace here. He's appealing to that. He's basically saying, we want to yield to you now. Please honor this, even though technically what we're doing is not according to your Torah. Okay? So the key is he's not being flippant with it. He's not being like, oh, well, that's not his attitude. He's very humble and he's very reverent here. Okay? So we were in verse 20. So Yahweh heard Hezekiah and healed the people. The sons of Israel present in Jerusalem celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days with great joy, and the Levites and the priests praised Yahweh day after day with loud instruments to Yahweh. Then Hezekiah spoke encouragingly to all the Levites who showed good insight in the things of Yahweh. So they ate for the appointed 7 days, sacrificing peace offerings and giving thanks to Yahweh Elohim of their fathers. Let's just keep going. Then the whole assembly decided to celebrate the feast another 7 days, so they celebrated the 7 days with joy. For Hezekiah, king of Judah, had contributed to the assembly 1,000 bulls, 7,000 sheep. The princes had contributed to the assembly 1,000 bulls and 10,000 sheep. And a large number of priests consecrated themselves. So they're consecrating themselves now after they've done the Passover. So it's a little late, but they're still doing it because they want to get right. All the assembly of Judah rejoiced, verse 25, with the priests and the Levites and all the assembly that came from Israel, both the sojourners who came from the land of Israel and those living in Judah. So there was a great joy in Jerusalem because there was nothing like this in Jerusalem since the days of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. Then the Levitical priests arose and blessed the people, and their voice was heard, and their prayer came to his holy dwelling place, to heaven. Okay? So this is amazing. And it's a slightly different take, because we read in 2 Kings that nothing like that had ever happened ever in the history of Israel from the time of the judges through the kings. So that implies that Josiah was like the pinnacle, but this is talking about with Hezekiah. So now we're going to go to 2 Chronicles 35. We're going to read about Josiah. Same basic idea. We're just going to get into more detail here. 2 Chronicles 35, we're going to read 1 through 19. Then Josiah celebrated the Passover to Yahweh in Jerusalem, and they slaughtered the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. He set the priests in their offices and encouraged them in the service of the house of Yahweh. He also said to the Levites who taught all the Israel and who were holy to Yahweh, "Put the holy ark in the house which Solomon the son of David, king of Israel, built. It will be a burden on your shoulders no longer. Now serve Yahweh your Elohim and his people Israel." So the temple at this point was standing without the Ark of the Covenant in it. This is before Nebuchadnezzar came and sacked the temple. There's no reason for that Ark of the Covenant not to be in the Holy of Holies unless they took it out. They probably put an idol in there or something. It doesn't say specifically here. So this is bad. That the priests were trying to do the right thing by taking care of the ark. They probably had it under a tent or something. They're moving it, they're taking care of it, but it belongs in the temple. So he's rectifying that wrong. And so we have, okay, so verse 4, prepare yourselves by your fathers' households and your divisions, according to the writing of David, king of Israel, and according to the writing of his son Solomon. Moreover, stand in the holy place according to the sections of the fathers' households of your brethren, the lay people, and according to the Levites, by division of the father's household. Now slaughter the Passover, he's talking to the priests, slaughter the Passover, sanctify yourselves, and prepare for your brethren to do according to the word of Yahweh by Moses. Josiah contributed to the lay people, to all who were present, flocks of lambs and young goats, all for the Passover offerings, numbering 30,000 plus 3,000 bulls. Those were from the king's possessions. His officers also contributed a freewill offering to the people. The priests and the Levites, Hilkiah and Zechariah and Jehiel, the officials of the house of Elohim, gave to the priests for the Passover offerings 2,600 from the flocks and 300 bulls. Conaniah also, and Shemaiah and Nethanel, his brothers, and Hashabiah and Jeiel, and Jozabad, the officers of the Levites, contributed to the Levites for the Passover offerings of 5,000 from the flocks and 500 bulls. Now, this is interesting to me because these Levites are contributing livestock. Levites are not supposed to have livestock. They're not supposed to own property. They're not supposed to, they're supposed to just be, they can live in the towns and things, but they're not allowed to, have this kind of stuff. So, to me, it begs the question, did they lax that over the years? And the Levitical priests were accumulating property and things, which really they weren't supposed to. But either way, somehow or other, they had all of this livestock that they were contributing. So verse 10, so the service was prepared, and the priests stood at their stations, and the Levites by their divisions, according to the king's command. They slaughtered the Passover, and while the priests sprinkled the blood received from their hand, the Levites skinned them. So this is another technical aspect of it. Like when you go back to Exodus 12, it doesn't talk about shearing the wool off first. It doesn't talk about skinning it. This says they were skinning it. So to me, if we factor this in, the whole process gets much cleaner. It gets much less messy. It gets much nicer. So we're looking at basically the same procedure that you would use to barbecue a deer or whatever else you had, whatever other animal. It's not that dissimilar from it. Okay, so we were in verse 12. Then they removed the burnt offerings that they might give them to the sections of the fathers' households of the lay people to present to Yahweh, as it is written in the book of Moses. They did this also with the bulls. So that's a separate little thing because they're doing bulls and things too. So not only are the priests, helping the people prepare the Passover, but they're also doing all these other free will offerings on the side. So these priests are very busy right now. They were literally professional butchers. People lose sight of that. That was their profession. They're butchering animals all day when they're in service. So they're doing a lot here. Verse 13, so they roasted the Passover on the fire according to the ordinance, and they boiled the holy things in pots and kettles and pans and carried them speedily to all the lay people. So the priests are basically, the way it reads to me, the priests are the ones here actually cooking the Passover lambs for the people, and then they're distributing everything out. So the way this reads to me, it's not a bunch of families just getting together like in Exodus 12. This is more of a huge community thing. And the temple, the priesthood, is the hub of it. So, you could extrapolate that out and say, it's one big family, it's one big house, right? The house of Israel, Yahweh's people. So it's all being done in the same house if you think of it that way. But this is another case where I think technically they're maybe not doing it exactly like Exodus 12 says. Verse 14, afterwards they prepared for themselves and for the priests, because the priests, the sons of Aaron, were offering the burnt offerings and the fat until night. Therefore the Levites prepared for themselves and for the priests, the sons of Aaron. So in other words, the priests are so busy doing all the other offerings that you've got Levites again coming in to help with the Passover. And this time it's not because the priests are unclean, it's because the priests are busy doing a bunch of other sacrifices. So they need more, more enlistment, I guess. They need more help. Okay, so we'll stop there. Actually, no, let's keep going. The singers, the sons of Asaph, verse 15, were also at their stations according to the command of David, Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun, the king's seer. And the gatekeepers at each gate did not have to depart from their service, because the Levites, their brethren, prepared for them. They're all serving each other. Imagine that, right? They're bearing each other's burdens. So all the service of Yahweh was prepared on that day to celebrate the Passover and to offer burnt offerings on the altar of Yahweh according to the command of King Josiah. Thus the sons of Israel who were present celebrated the Passover at that time, and the feast of unleavened bread 7 days. There had not been celebrated a Passover like it in Israel since the days of Samuel the prophet, nor had any of the kings of Israel celebrated such a Passover as Josiah did with the priests, the Levites, all Judah and Israel who were present, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. In the 18th year of Josiah's reign, his Passover was celebrated. So, I mean, grammatically, this is even saying Hezekiah's Passover wasn't in this same ballpark. And Hezekiah's Passover seemed pretty significant. So I don't know. This is where I say, like, scholars look at this and they think that, different editors and things, opinionized and whatever. I don't personally believe that in every case, but it is just something interesting. So we're going to read, we're getting close to being done here. We're going to go to the book of Ezra. So everything we've read so far is prior to the temple being destroyed. They have a functional priesthood. They have a functional temple. Everything is peachy. Went right past Ezra there. We're going to read Ezra chapter 6. Now they have come back into Jerusalem, and they're trying to get everything reestablished. The temple's been dedicated at this point, and so now they're trying to get things rolling again. So let's start reading in verse 19. The exiles, in other words, the people that have returned from exile, observed the Passover on the 14th of the first month. For the priests and the Levites had purified themselves together. All of them were pure. Then they slaughtered the Passover for all the exiles, both for their brothers, the priests, and for themselves. The sons of Israel who returned from exile, and all those who had separated themselves, and this is important, all of those who had separated themselves from the impurity of the nations of the land to join them, to seek Yahweh Elohim of Israel, ate the Passover. So these are the Israelites, they're mostly Jews, but they all came back from Babylon. They're getting things reestablished. They're doing Passover. This time, unlike under Hezekiah, all the priests are prepared. Everybody's ready to go this time. And it says specifically that these people who were coming separated themselves from the impurity of the nations of the land. So, to me, this is a key component of Passover. If you look at the original Passover, they were leaving one kingdom to come into another. It's a transitional thing. Passover is for people who are wanting to be and are committed to Yahweh's kingdom. Passover is not for people who are not in Yahweh's kingdom. So when I see people on YouTube and stuff, they have these big outreach Passovers, and the Baptist church is involved and all this kind of stuff. It makes me cringe because most of the people in that room have no interest in covenanting with Yahweh on his terms. It's a party to them in a lot of cases. It's something neat and shiny and interesting, and maybe they think it'll help their biblical understanding, but they're not thinking of it in terms of covenantal commitment. And so this is really important. And you read the whole book of Ezra, you read Nehemiah, the whole thing is, we got into this trouble because we were too lax on the covenant. We got into this trouble because we were being too much like the nations. We're going to stop all that now, and we're going to hunker down. And to me, Passover is all about that. It's about coming out of Egypt, doing things Yahweh's way, yielding 100% to his authority, and then you're coming into his kingdom. So now we're going to read just a few more verses. We're almost done. And we've asked some of these should we questions as we've gone through. We've been dealing mostly with can we, how do we do it, the nuts and bolts of it. And in my opinion, all the nuts and bolts aspects of it to the letter can be done today with the right amount of preparation. That's just the punchline of this whole thing. I think everything in Exodus 12 we can do if we prepare enough ahead of time and if we get together and work through it and resolve ourselves to do it. So then at that point, it's just a question of should we, and each household, each family has to answer this question for that household. So Exodus 13, let's go back there. We read Exodus 12 earlier, but Exodus 13 is sort of a continuation. Exodus 13, we're going to read verses 1 through 16. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Sanctify to me every firstborn, the first offspring of every womb among the sons of Israel, both man and beast, it belongs to me." Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you went out from Egypt, from the house of slavery. For by a powerful hand Yahweh brought you out from this place, and nothing leavened shall be eaten. On this day, in the month of Abib, you are about to go forth. It shall be when Yahweh brings you to the land of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall observe this rite in this month. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a feast to Yahweh. Unleavened bread shall be eaten throughout the 7 days, and nothing leavened shall be seen among you, nor any leaven be seen among you in all your borders. And again, we're going to get into more detail on unleavened bread next month. You shall tell your son or your child on that day, saying, it is because of what Yahweh did for me when I came out of Egypt. And it shall serve as a sign to you on your hand, and as a reminder on your forehead, this is the same language from Deuteronomy 6, that the law of Yahweh may be in your mouth. For with a powerful hand Yahweh brought you out of Egypt. Has anyone been brought out of Egypt spiritually? I'm going to raise my hand. That's the hope anyway. The blood of the Lamb is what triggers us to leave Egypt. You cannot leave Egypt unless you come under the blood of the Lamb. And he's invoking this language here about it being a sign on our hand and a reminder on our forehead. And like I said, this goes back to Deuteronomy 6. But if you look forward to Revelation 13, there's another sign on somebody's right hand and another sign on somebody's forehead. So again, this is about authority. This is about two kingdoms. You do things Yahweh's way, including Passover. It's a sign on your hand and on your forehead. It's something that you do with your hand, and it's your thoughts. So you are submitting to his kingdom in your actions and in your thoughts. This is the antidote to the coming mark of the beast. If you want to avoid the mark of the beast, take on the mark of Yahweh. It's really simple. Okay, so we were in verse 10. Therefore, you shall keep this ordinance at its appointed time from year to year. Now, when Yahweh brings you to the land of the Canaanite, as he swore to you and your fathers, and gives it to you, you shall devote to Yahweh the first offspring of every womb, and the first offspring of every beast that you own. The males belong to Yahweh. But every first offspring of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. But if you do not redeem it, then you shall break its neck, and every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. And it shall be when your son or your child asks you in time to come, saying, what is this? Then you shall say to them, with a powerful hand Yahweh brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. It came about when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go that Yahweh killed every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sacrifice to Yahweh the males, the first offspring of every womb, but every firstborn of my sons I redeem. Because we don't do sacrifice of humans in Yahweh's kingdom. That's the other guys. So it shall serve as a sign on your hand and as phylacteries on your forehead, for with a powerful hand Yahweh brought us up out of Egypt. So again, when Yahweh brought the people out of Egypt, yes, it was to fulfill the promise to Abraham, which is still technically not fulfilled. He was partially fulfilled, but it's never been fully fulfilled. But it was also to show the nations Yahweh was sovereign over the nations. And we see in our scriptures when kings forget that, like Nebuchadnezzar, King Herod, bad things happen. Okay? And I think if we look around in the world today, we don't have our Bibles, we don't have prophets telling us this, but if we look at the kings of this world, the powers that should not be, we see bad things happening to them, which does happen. It's probably the same principle. We just don't have our Bibles telling us that in real time. So we don't necessarily see it the same way. So Deuteronomy 6. We got to go to Deuteronomy 6. I've already mentioned it. This was quoted by the Messiah in his ministry. This is huge, Deuteronomy 6. Okay, so now this is the commandment, the statutes and the judgments which Yahweh your Elohim has commanded me to teach you. This is Moses talking. That you might do them in the land where you're going over to possess it. So that you and your son and your grandson might fear Yahweh your Elohim, to keep all the statutes and his commandments which I command you all the days of your life, that your days may be prolonged. O Israel, you should listen and be careful to do it, that it may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, just as Yahweh, the Elohim of your fathers, has promised you in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our Elohim. Yahweh is one. You shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. We just read where Josiah did this. We know the Messiah himself, Yahshua, said that this is the great commandment. Okay, so we have this one, and then we have in Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself. and on those two commandments hang all the other commandments. They don't replace all the other commandments. They're not in their stead, but they are the foundation of every single commandment. And so these words which I'm commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Then it shall be, it will come about when Yahweh your Elohim brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you, great and splendid cities which you did not build, houses full of all good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, and you eat and are satisfied. Then watch yourself, that you do not forget Yahweh who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall fear only Yahweh your Elohim, and you shall worship him and swear by his name, his authority. In other words, when we take an oath, when we swear by Yahweh's name, we're invoking his authority in that oath. We are saying all the contracts, all the terms of this oath, whatever I commit to, the terms and conditions, are under Yahweh's authority, not man's authority. That's the highest form of oath or vow a person can do. And so, so verse 14, you shall not follow other gods or other Elohim, any of the gods of the people who surround you. For Yahweh your Elohim in the midst of you is a jealous Elohim. Otherwise, the anger of Yahweh your Elohim will be kindled against you, and he will wipe you off the face of the earth. You shall not put Yahweh your Elohim to the test, as you tested him at Massah. Now that was quoted to the devil when he was testing Yahshua in the wilderness. So it's interesting how, whenever the Messiah would combat his enemies, whether it's Satan himself, whether it's the Pharisees, regardless of who it was, he keeps going back to Moses. He keeps going back to Deuteronomy. He'll go to Isaiah. He just keeps going back to these sacred scriptures as his point of reference for why he's doing what he's doing and the basis for his authority. So we were in verse 17. You shall diligently keep the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim and his testimonies and his statutes which he has commanded you. Can you guys still hear me with the heater on? It's pretty loud back here. I'm not sure. Okay. So you shall do what is right and good. You shall do what is right and good in the sight of Yahweh, that it may be well with you, and that you may go in and possess the good land which Yahweh swore to give your fathers, by driving out all the enemies from before you as Yahweh has spoken. When your son asks you in time to come, now how many times, I don't know if anybody's taken count, but several times we've read, when your son asks you, when your child asks you. The whole idea is what we're doing in front of our children, and our children are seeing it. And children are curious. So we as parents need to make sure that and this is just a general principle, that when our children ask us questions about our faith and our beliefs and why we do what we're doing, we need to have a ready response. We can't just say, well, let me think about it and get back to you next week. If we can't explain what we're doing, we have a problem. And any of us, we have to be able to do that. Like, that's just basic. And so, where were we here? We were in verse 20. When your son asks you in time to come, saying, what do the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments mean which Yahweh our Elohim has commanded us? Then you shall say to your son or your child, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and Yahweh brought us from Egypt with a mighty hand. Moreover, Yahweh showed great and distressing signs and wonders before our eyes against Egypt, Pharaoh, and all his household. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in. This is this same concept of going from one kingdom into another. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land which he has sworn to our fathers. So Yahweh commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear Yahweh, our Elohim, for our good always, and for our survival as it is today. It will be righteousness for us if we are careful to observe all the commandments before Yahweh our Elohim, just as he commanded us. So I wanted to read that whole chapter because it talks about that same idea of the sign on our hand and our forehead, this submission to Yahweh's authority and our actions and our thoughts and our will. But it's also Moses is talking about all of Yahweh's commandments under this umbrella. And Passover is one of those commandments. So I don't think that we have license here. And I talk about sometimes when we get into the New Testament, people act like everything changed. You know, oh, we had to keep the commandments in the Old Testament. Now that we're in the New Testament, we don't have to. There is no setup at all in the Old Testament for that happening. Moses never set it up. The prophets never set it up. Yahweh himself never set it up. So if you've got somebody coming on the scene saying, hey, I'm the Messiah that the prophets prophesied, and by the way, I'm doing away with the law of Moses, that would have been a big red flag. And you don't see that anywhere in the New Testament either. So there's zero setup anywhere in our Bibles for any of Yahweh's commandments being done away with. And Passover would be one of those. And we know from Matthew chapter 5, where he says that not one jot or tittle from the Torah will pass away. As long as we have heaven and earth, every single jot and tittle, every single letter, everything, it's all there. And he says that whoever teaches and whoever keeps and teaches the commandments will be great in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever teaches not to do the commandments, even the least of the commandments, will be least in the kingdom. Well, that would include Passover. So to me, this is getting into the should we. Yes, we should. He's telling us. He's telling us to do it. We have numerous positive commands to do Passover. We have numerous positive commands to do it a specific way. And we have cases where if we can't do it a specific way for whatever our circumstances are, if our hearts are heading towards Yahweh and we're trending towards obedience and we are genuinely trying to submit to his will, he makes accommodations for that, like under King Hezekiah. Okay? That's not saying let's be flippant with it, but it's saying if there are little details here and there that we just can't do because of our circumstances, that should not stop us from trying, at all. Like it's not licensed just to like, well, let's just throw our hands up and not do any of it because we can't do it perfectly. Because that's a slippery slope that leads us into not obeying any of the commandments. Like, well, we can't keep the commandments perfectly, so therefore let's not keep any of them. That logic is it goes nowhere good. So we're just going to go one more scripture. We got to close with Paul because Paul talks about it. 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. I'm going to read the whole chapter because there's some context here that's important. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. It is actually reported that there is immorality among you, and immorality is such a kind as does not exist even among the Gentiles, that someone has his father's wife. Now this is the assembly in Corinth. This is a Gentile assembly. This is right smack in the middle of one of the pagan meccas of the known world at that time. And he's saying that, he's talking to this assembly, and he's saying, there's behavior in this assembly that I don't even see out in the Gentiles. So right there, if we slow down and think, nobody in this assembly is a Gentile. He's contrasting this assembly with the Gentiles outside the assembly. And it goes back to Romans 11. It goes back to Ephesians chapter 2. When you covenant with Israel, when you submit to Yahweh's authority as the God of Israel, you are no longer a Gentile. Don't call yourself a Gentile. It melts my mind because I struggle to see, when we read our scriptures, you cease to become a Gentile or to be a Gentile when you become Israel. You can't be both. It's one or the other. It's one of those two kingdoms. So grammatically, he's saying here that this assembly, yes, it's going to have biological Gentiles in it, but they are not Gentiles because he's comparing them to Gentiles outside the assembly. Does that make sense? You have become arrogant and have not mourned instead, so that the one who had done this deed would be removed from your midst. So they're letting this go on. Everybody knows, and they're letting it happen. For I, on my part, though absent in body but present in spirit, have already judged him who has so committed this, as though I were present. We're not supposed to judge each other, right? But yet here Paul is doing it. In the name of our master Yahshua, when you are assembled, and I with you in the spirit, with the power of our master Yahshua, I have decided to deliver this one over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the master Yahshua. Now, I have no idea what Paul's talking about here. This is one of those cases where I get to use those three words, I don't know. I really don't know what he means. I've seen so many theories. I know that the Catholic Inquisition used this as one of their proof texts for what they were doing, torturing people. We're gonna torture their flesh to save their spirit. And to me, that makes no sense. If Yahweh himself wants to do that, if he wants to afflict us, like with Job, to get our attention or to teach us something, that's his business. But I don't see any grounds for us to do that to each other. So I don't really know what Paul's talking about here. Verse 6, your boasting is not good. Do you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? And this is something that I've been learning about over the past 2, 3, 4 years, thanks to my lovely wife, teaching me about sourdough bread and how that works and bread making in general. Once you put leaven in bread, it ain't going anywhere. You can't take it out. Like, if you make a loaf of bread, try taking the leaven out. You can't do it. I mean, the only way you could take it out is to eat it and let your body do it. But you can't do it while it's in the bread. It's impossible. So that's going to be interesting here as we go along. So a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are, in fact, unleavened. Now again, what I just said, logically, technically, this doesn't make sense. You can't clean out old leaven once it's already introduced to the lump. So this is like born-again language. This is transformation language. This is saying you cannot be the same lump you were before with that old leaven. You've got to become a new piece of bread. You've got to become a new batch of sourdough. So in other words, when you were in your sin, when you were in the lust of the world and the lust of your flesh, you were like a bad batch of sourdough. Well, that's not good. Nobody's going to want bread from a bad batch of sourdough. So we're starting over with a new batch here. So clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Messiah, for Christ, our Passover, also has been sacrificed. And then this is one of the should we verses. So we know that typologically the Passover lamb points to Messiah. It points to Calvary. Okay, the lamb that was slain before the foundations of the world. We know that concretely, absolutely. And so there's an argument to be made. Well, now that this has happened, and the shadow, because he talks about in Colossians 2 about the shadow and the substance. Now that we have the substance, we don't do the shadow anymore. So you have people who will use this scripture to say, well, now that Messiah has come, we either A, don't do Passover at all anymore because it's been fulfilled, or if we are to do Passover, B, we don't eat lamb. Because the Lamb of Yahweh was slain, that's over and done. If we eat lamb, we're basically nullifying what he did, we're transgressing in some way. So there are people that will eat turkey or chicken or things for Passover instead of lamb, based on this idea. And to me, I just don't see a setup for that anywhere in the scripture saying, when the spiritual application of this comes to fruition, then you don't do the physical anymore. I don't see that. What I see through the whole scripture is when you do the physical and the spiritual together, they reinforce each other, and that strengthens your faith and everything grows in a positive way. But when you decouple them and when you divorce them from each other, things don't work the way the Father intended. You had the Pharisees who were trying to do everything in the literal, but they were ignoring the spirit of it. And then you've got mainstream Christians who try to do things, the spiritual principles and the principles, but they ignore the literal, and they're missing the point just like the Pharisees were, just in a different way. But the Father wants us to do both, equal weights and measures. And then Paul says, but Paul says, right? Let's see what Paul said. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast. Hallelujah. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast. Not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So, for the Paul guys, he's point blank. He just mentioned Passover. He's talking about unleavened bread, and then he says, therefore, let us celebrate the feast. What's he talking about? He doesn't say, therefore, let us spiritually celebrate the feast. Let's get together and pray and, have, Chris Tomlin on the, no. He's not talking about that. No, I like Chris Tomlin. But it's that's not what he's talking about. That's a Christianized way of looking at this. He's talking about keep the Passover. Therefore, let us keep the Passover. But let's keep going because this is relevant too. I wrote, verse 9, I wrote you in my letter not to associate with immoral people. So again, there's this idea of separation, of holiness. I did not at all mean with the immoral people of this world, or with the covetous and swindlers, or with idolaters, for then you would have to go out to the world. So he's talking to people in camp, in the house. But actually, I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother if he is an immoral person, or covetous, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or a swindler, not even to eat with such a one. So people in the camp, people in-house, he wants us to separate from. Because the whole idea of being in Yahweh's house is it's a holy house. Verse 12, for what have I to do with judging outsiders? Do you not judge those who are within the assembly? We're supposed to judge each other. We have a commandment back in Leviticus 19 to reprove your neighbor when he sins so that there's no sin in the camp, there's no transgression. If we're going to have a holy God living in our camp, in our midst, we need to be a holy people. And so we need to hold each other accountable when we see each other transgress. And collectively, we're not doing that because we've been taught that you can't. You can't judge people. We're not passing sentence. I'm not looking around and saying, well, you guys are all going to hell because you're not doing X, Y, Z. That's not my place. But we're judging our behavior, and we're saying your behavior is wrong. Let's work together and fix it. We're supposed to do that. And that's the whole thing. Like, when we don't do that, this bad leaven comes into the lump. This whole principle of leaven comes into play. You know, leaven is doctrine. Leaven doesn't, like, it's not sin. Leaven is doctrine, it's teaching when we look at it symbolically. There's good teaching, there's bad teaching. There's good doctrine, there's bad doctrine. You know? But verse 13, but those who are outside, Elohim judges. Remove the wicked man from among yourselves, he says. So he's talking about, and he's using Passover and unleavened bread as like a visual kind of way of talking about this idea of holiness. You know? So the whole thing is connected. So, to summarize this, you know, we read all of the relevant scriptures that I can find on how to keep Passover. And then we've kind of talked about, like, well, can we in modern times? And it's my opinion that yes, we can. You know, if we are willing to put in the preparation time, if we're willing to get together, you know, then we can make a way for this to happen. There really shouldn't be any excuse for someone not to be able to do Passover the way it's written, okay? And then when we find ourselves in scenarios where there's little technical things that maybe we can't do, it's my opinion that it's okay to go ahead anyway. Now, circumcision's a big one. I don't think we can transgress that one. That's pretty clear. But there's other things, like maybe timing. The calendar thing's a big deal. How many calendars are going on now? You know, everybody's on the right calendar, and everybody else is on the wrong calendar, right? So, you know, who's right? So I think Yahweh allows room for that kind of stuff, you know, regardless of what calendar a person's on. If their motivations are pure, if they're doing the best they can with the information that they have, I think Yahweh honors that person. So I think that takes away some of the excuses that we have not to keep Passover as prescribed. And with the should we, I think absolutely yes. You know, having done Passover before with an actual lamb, and I say this with Sabbath, you know, we know that the scriptures talk about Messiah being our Sabbath rest, right? The churches will say, well, Jesus is my Sabbath rest. I don't have to keep the Sabbath because Jesus is my Sabbath rest. You don't understand what that means unless you keep the Sabbath. Like, you can know things about the Sabbath and maybe understand some principles, but unless you actually observe the Sabbath willingly and with intent and with repetition, you don't understand what it means for Messiah to be our Sabbath rest. You can't relate to it. And so you can't call him your Passover lamb and understand what that really, really means unless you keep Passover. You know, when we started doing like an actual lamb, like it's intense. Like it's an emotional experience. And when you know what that lamb represents, and when you know that the lamb, capital L-A-M-B, had to die because of us, it makes the whole thing so much more real. Calvary just becomes like this 3D high-definition experience that you're experiencing and living, and you don't get that unless you do Passover. It's the difference between knowing a person and knowing things about a person. You don't know the lamb unless you do the things the lamb did, unless you do Passover. You may know things about him, but we don't truly know him. This is my perspective. So I'm going to close with that. Hopefully that covers the basis. Like I said, next month we'll drill in specifically on the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you know, leaven, you know, all that kinds of stuff. What is leaven, what is not, house cleaning, principles, and things like that. And then I'm purposely leaving out the Last Supper because that is connected to Passover, but it's sort of a different thing because there's this debate, was the Last Supper a Passover meal? Was it not? There's two camps on that. I don't really want to get into that today. This is just strictly, if you're going to keep Passover, what does it look like? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and we will go ahead and open the floor for questions, comments, and strong opinions. I'm okay with strong opinions.